Hi, my name is Angela Ruiz. Welcome to my video. So it's the middle of the year. What are some goals that you would like to have to finish out the year? Well, before I get started, there are several things that I'm going to talk about, and just to kind of give you an overview, I'm going to give you some updates about what's going on with me. And then the second thing is I'm going to go into the mindset that you need to be in before you do any kind of goal setting. Then I'm going to give you the 5 tips. So some of the updates that I have for you is, first and foremost, we're moving to a 3-bedroom townhouse. And that third bedroom is going to be an office. I'm going to have an office again. We already have my desk set up. Thank you to Chris for finding that desk for me. I'm pretty excited about it. I finally got that ring light and, kind of a thing to set on the desk to hold the camera up, because as of right now, the camera is on a music stand, and obviously, the light is behind me and not in front of me. And so that's one of the great things, is that I will have an office. The second thing is I'm working on starting a business. It'll be a proofreading business. For now, I'll strictly be proofreading, and then it may evolve into more than that. But just to make you aware, there is a proofreading business coming. And so if you yourself are in college, or if you have a college student, or just anything that you would require a second set of eyes to make sure that there are no grammatical or punctuation errors, definitely hit me up. I'll let you know what the name and stuff is when I get that LLC in place. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about to update you guys is where I am on my self-acceptance journey. And so I've kind of gone through the exercise for each level of survival response. And so now I'm working on an embodied technique of being aware on a regular basis of where I am physically. So that way I can kind of do some breathing techniques, create space to separate my brain from my body. So that way I can just sit in that body response, and then help myself and my body to realize that this is a survival technique that I developed as a child. That's usually when we develop these survival techniques. And that while this feeling of, fear or whatever is very real, it is no longer the truth. Like, whatever stressful situation I'm in, body, I'm not going to die, right? Because that's what survival is, and our implicit memory wants us to do, is it wants us to survive. So just to recap on that part, I'm moving, I'm starting a business, and where I am on my self-acceptance journey. So now I'm going to talk about your mindset before you go into goal setting. And this goes back into self-acceptance. First and foremost, you want to make sure that you are happy with who you are now on the inside and on the outside. I've been reading this book by Mark Manson. If you want the title of that book, shoot me a message, because I'm going to try to keep this PG, and the title isn't quite PG. So hit me up if you want to know what the title of that book is. It's a very, very good book. It's very concise. It's very real. It gets down to business. There's no fluff. So what he kind of talks about is we care about too many things, and it's affecting our mental health. Okay. And so what you want to do is to make sure that before you get started, you are okay with who you are now. And so some kind of things that you can do to jumpstart that process is, express gratitude each day, either in the morning or at night or both, to realize, you know, what you enjoy about yourself now, and what maybe you care too much about that you need to let go. Because as I'm going to go into the tips, you want to prioritize. And sometimes in life, when we care about too many things, we tend to prioritize the wrong thing. And he has kind of a funny quote about how and caring about too many things. We don't notice that, we're missing out on our kids or a dog's mad. We're more upset. We end up becoming more upset about the cashier giving us nickels for wherever we're checking out and being snarky, or we're upset about a show being canceled. So ultimately, our priorities get shifted, or they're too spread out to where, we're missing out on our kids. Our dog hates us, but we're more worried about nickels and everybody loves Raymond. So that's a great quote from the book. And so, like I said, make sure you prioritize. There's also another great article about this with the spoons theory. It's from a website called You Don't Look Sick, and it comes from a place of someone who has autoimmune disease, and that's kind of a thing too. I don't have one, but it's kind of a thing that hits close to home for me, because I have some family members who do, and it can also be related to a mental health thing. Like, those are obviously illnesses that you cannot see, but they are illnesses that cut the spoons you start out with at the beginning of the day. So basically, what that is going into is you start each day with only a certain number of spoons. So let's say you give a spoon to getting out of bed, you give a spoon to, doing your job, and then you go through your day and you have a finite number, and so you have to prioritize what you do. I feel like those two things are related in caring about too much and having not enough spoons, is that when you go into that with that mentality, you will certainly have priorities in place to make sure that, number one, you are happy with yourself as who you are now. So that way you have room to stop caring about stuff that doesn't matter. And so you can move forward to where you would like to be, wherever you would like to be once you achieve your goals. So first, you have to be happy with yourself before you get started. So now I'm going to get into the 5 tips. So tip number 1, define what your goal is. Brian Tracy has a great technique where you take out a pen and piece of paper and you take 30 seconds to write down what you would like to accomplish. And usually the first 3 things on that list are your priorities. So the very first thing, you want to kind of, come up with a rough sketch of what you want to accomplish. Tip number 1. Tip number 2, turn whatever you wrote down into a SMART goal. A SMART goal is specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. And so I'm going to give an example. So for me, my health has always been a thing. Like, obviously, looking at me, you wouldn't know it, but year after year, my blood work comes back perfect. My blood pressure comes back perfect, but I will acknowledge, being the size that I am, while I love me, is not going to be, ultimately, it's like a ticking time bomb of, eventually it's not going to be perfect. And so, while I'm happy with my wellness now, I definitely need to plan for the future. So something specifically to me are, I know for a fact that I have a sensitivity to gluten and dairy. So by September, definitely, I want to make sure that I've started to eliminate those 2 things from my daily diet. And so how I will measure that is obviously the number of times I don't eat gluten and dairy, because I'm not going to pretend like I'm never going to eat it again. The 80-20 method is where I'm going. And so that's also measurement too. It's 80% of the time I'm going to eat how I like to eat, but I know is good for my body. And then 20% I may throw in some ice cream and deal with the consequences there. All right. But that is attainable to me, because I know how well I feel when I eat that way. And it's relevant to me, just on the premise that there are, while generally speaking, according to the numbers and the blood work, that I am well, There are just things I want to get back into doing that I used to do, like dancing, which will be a form of exercise that I do, but also just kind of getting back into the forms of Shaolin Kung Fu. And so that's what makes those things relevant to me. And then time bound by September, I want to eliminate those two things from my diet. So now that we've gotten smart about that goal, the next thing you want to do is reverse engineer it. So starting from where I want to be in September, coming backwards, what are things that I'm going to have to, I have a pen in my hand, sorry. What are things that I'm going to have to accomplish starting from where I want to be, going back to where I am now? And so that's tip number 3, reverse engineer it. Tip number 4 is once you have your plan, execute that plan. Now, I know sometimes we get analysis paralysis and we get afraid to get started. And so this is probably the most important tip of all the tips, is make sure that you do what you planned you were going to do, because if you don't get started, you'll just be postponing where you want to be, which, isn't necessarily a bad thing. And something I forgot to cover back in tip number 2 is when we define goals, going back to tip number 2, SMART goals, typically we define it through what success looks like. And so it comes from a place of getting to where we want to be based on what we lack, which Mark Manson talks about. We don't want to come from a place of lack. So obviously, you have your self-acceptance, but you know where you want to go. The thing about it is when you focus on what success looks like only, you ignore the negative, and by ignoring the negative, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot because the negative exists. So when you're creating these goals, you want to make sure when you define them, you also get specific about what you're willing to sacrifice to be whoever and to do whatever you want to do when you achieve that goal, to improve upon the awesomeness that you already are. And also just some kind of bumps in the road, like going into tip number 3, reverse engineering it. If I know that I want to accomplish this goal by September, what are things that I have going on between now and then that could throw a monkey wrench in it? Because I will personally say that 20% I am going to accommodate for, we all don't live in our kitchens 24/7. Let's just be real here. We cannot hide in our houses because, number one, it's not healthy to stress about each and every single thing you put in your mouth unless you are like a numbers person and that doesn't negatively affect your ability to continue. But when I go visit family for very brief periods, or if I go visit friends, I don't want to go to someone else's house and completely dishevel what they've already got going on, especially if my mom's making collard greens with the ham hocks. You best believe when I go home, I'm going to eat that, right? If I'm going to go home and my dad has pasteles and arroz con gandules ready for me to go, I'm eating that. So you have to make sure that bump in the road is there, and that, once you acknowledge it, you also need to acknowledge how much of that do you want to do, because as I said, you don't want to create too much of an upheaval for me. That's me personally. But you also kind of want to put limits on yourself, so that way you don't end up with your third pastele and your third Malta. So that goes into being specific and reverse engineering it. Execute it. Tip number 4, make sure you're doing the thing. And then tip number 5, stay consistent. Tip number 5, make sure you're staying on plan, so that way you follow the plan as closely as possible, considering the bumps in the road. So by September, you will look, or whenever you decide to place the end of your goal to make it achievable and attainable, that you will have built a habit which I'm going to do another video in the future on building habits. So just to recap on the tips, number 1, define your goal. Number 2, flesh out that goal into a SMART goal. Number 3, reverse engineer it. Number 4, execute it. And then number 5, stay consistent. If you would like the resources I've used to come up with the content for this video, shoot me a message and I'll get that right over to you. I used a couple of websites and a couple of great books and methods by a couple of great authors, which I have mentioned. And so if you would like those, definitely hit me up and I will see you next time.